Thank you for joining today for this webinar from Convergent Research. My name is Neelam Nalamore, and I'm the Evaluation and Engagement Officer here at the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation. I just wanted to start with a few housekeeping items. We will be recording today's session, and by registering for this information session, participants acknowledge that their photographs and/or videos may be taken by our staff. Furthermore, participants grant the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation permission to use those photographs and/or videos, including for our websites and print publications, without compensation or reward. Alrighty, and then also at the end of the meeting, there'll be a short feedback request. We'd be very appreciative if you would share your thoughts, so that way we can provide quality content for you moving forward. All right, now that that's out of the way, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Wang. Mary is the head of strategic initiatives at Convergent Research, where she works to advance the organization's immediate and long-term strategy vision. Previously, she led strategic planning and served as chief of staff to the CEO at Scripps Research and Caliber. Mary received her PhD in chemical engineering from Northwestern University and her BS from MIT. Welcome, Mary. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks for the intro. All right. So today, we'll be talking about Convergent Research and the focused research organizations that we launch. So, we operate as a meta science organization. We build new institutions to develop missing fundamental capabilities. So often progress in science is stalled not by a lack of ideas, but by technical bottlenecks that our current systems are not structured to solve. So we build institutions called focused research organizations or FROs that target specific technical goals. And we provide the parent structure and governance to incubate these projects. And so, as a scientist, you've probably seen how academia is fairly optimized for creative work done by individuals, whereas startups are really optimized for product market fit. And so there's a middle ground where engineering intensive work that requires a high level of coordination but doesn't have, near-term profitability. And so we build institutions to fill this gap. Um, in the current R&D landscape, which in this paper, the Innovation Menagerie, describes, I think, pretty well. In the last 5 years, there's been sort of an increase in the number of different types of non-academic R&D organizations, and they, can sort of be represented on this sliding scale of like small teams to large teams, um, and different types of funding, right? And so, as we talked about, academia is really great at exploratory research and individual novelty, but is less structured for high levels of coordination or engineering projects. And startups are great at coordinating, but are limited by their need for product market fit and commercial returns. Um, there's also different types of, right, core facilities or for-profit institutes, as well as new types of non-profit research institutes that are emerging in the landscape. And so focused research organizations are, on one end of this, where they're led by CEOs, they have professional teams, they have project-specific funding, but are funded by nonprofit or philanthropic or government funding. Um, there's also different funders in the landscape um, that can support R&D beyond venture capital. And so we're seeing, NSF. I don't know if you guys saw their announcement about the Tech Labs initiative, but they're starting to explore new types of organizational models. And then, of course, the ARPA agencies fund different kinds of performers. And then on the other side, there's organizations that are building new groups, and so we're one of them. But there's also new types of research institutes like the ARC Institute. I think one, distinction that is sometimes helpful to make is the difference between focused research organizations and ARPA agencies. So agencies like DARPA or ARIA, which is a UK ARPA-style science funding agency, are great at taking systematic shots on goal. So they're funding multiple competing groups to find a path. But sometimes there is no existing organization, so either, a for-profit or academic performer that can solve the types of problems that ARPA agencies are trying to solve. And so in those cases, you have to create the performer. So that's our role. We are sort of nucleating the types of organization that, an ARPA style agency could fund. And so we talk about how FROs are designed to create scientific infrastructure. So we're inspired by projects like the Human Genome Project or the Hubble Space Telescope or Large Hadron Collider that are not the result of a single brilliant discovery, um, but require industrial style engineering and massive coordination to build new tools or data sets that then become transformative for, an entire field of astronomers, biologists, or physicists. So unlike these projects, which are kind of billion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar scale projects, we believe that there's a mid-scale gap, so projects that require 10 to 30 people and maybe 20 to 50 million dollars over 3 to 7 years. That's roughly the size of a Series A deep tech startup, but that has a scientific infrastructure goal, and that falls through the cracks of traditional research funding. Um, as kind of to illustrate the types of projects that we think about, we built something called the Gap Map. So you can check it out at, I think it's gap-map.org. Um, but it is a database of different types of scientific bottlenecks and potential solutions that we've come across as we've had conversations with many, many different scientists over the years. It's by no means comprehensive, but it is illustrative of the sort of scale of problems that we're interested in. Not all of them need to be solved by FROs. Some of them can be solved, by academic consortia. Some of them can be solved by startups. But amongst those projects or amongst those needed capabilities, there are many that are maybe FRO shaped. And so, yeah, this is a little bit more on the point of, right, we view FROs as deep tech startups for building public goods for science. And so, they look like startups in terms of their organization and teamwork, but the ultimate audience um, that will be using the outputs are probably more on the researcher side. And so, yeah, so the focus stands for finite duration, 5 to 7. Some of them are more on the 3 to 5 year timeline, but they all have a single North Star goal. So they're not doing, you know, disparate types of open-ended research. It really is a very focused effort with specific quantifiable milestones, as well as a thoughtful transition plan, right? So because it's finite duration, that doesn't mean that everything just disappears at the end of it. It just means that their incubation period as an FRO has come to an end, and they, might transition into, right, multiple startups or a single startup or into an independent nonprofit research organization. So they're doing research, they're focused on tackling very deep technical challenges, um, and they are led by they're as an organization, they're led by a full-time CEO and leadership team. They have professional hardware engineers, software engineers working alongside scientists, and they're very organized from a scientific and operational perspective. And so what makes a good FRO? So we look for problems that are very high impact. And so if you think of scientific discovery as sort of a technology tree, where, right, at the applications are more on the end of the branches, we look for problems that are sort of at the trunk of the tech tree and that can unlock many different types of um, downstream applications, but are not necessarily working directly on those applications, so more on the platform technology side. We also look for problems that can't be done in academic labs or in um, other types of traditional mechanisms. There's a lot more funding for startups by venture capital than there is for FROs. And so if a problem can be solved through an existing mechanism, we're very supportive of that. We try to find the problems, that don't have a good home in the existing ecosystem. Um, some additional thoughts on what we look for. We tend to look for problems that have, that cross a catalytic inflection point. And so, if you're thinking about a capability that exists today but could be much more transformative, you know, if it were more accessible or, if we're faster, cheaper, or better, there should be at least an order of magnitude improvement in the underlying capability. Um, and, it should be uh, neglected by other mechanisms, as well as come from creative, um, potentially non-consensus understanding or cross-disciplinary synthesis. So by that, we, all of our proposals go out for peer review, but we're not necessarily looking for a consensus agreement. We're looking for a strong response that indicates that people think this problem is really important and worth solving. Maybe the way to solve it is not obvious, but that, there's a reasonable chance of feasibility. Um, let's see. And so, as an organization, we bring together great ideas, founders, and funders. So many great ideas die because these three things don't align. For example, in the same 6-month window, we try to help solve this matching problem. And so we act as sort of a matchmaker as well as an incubator to bring these elements together. And for the FROs that we do launch, we, work to ensure that we set them up as much as possible for success. And so, yeah, FROs are really designed to enable focused sprints by moonshot teams, they are driven by a North Star. They're multidisciplinary, they're very technically oriented. They have a committed team as well as industrial grade R structure. And so we bring these elements together and work with the teams to make sure they're successful. So we've launched 10 FROs to date, and we're in the process of launching one more in the US and two in the UK this quarter. And so the topics are pretty diverse. They span, for example, Cultivarium is working on different tools to make non-model microbes um, uh, possible to grow and engineer. So they're working on bacteria as well as fungi and archaea. One of our newest projects is Dragonfly, which is building a telescope to create the first map of the cosmic web in the universe. We also have projects that are working on connectomics, as well as neurotechnology, as well as mapping drug target interactions. So you can see that, we think that FROs can be impactful in many, many different fields, and they're not really isolated to a single discipline. So just as a case study, Forest Neurotech um, is one of our FROs. They are working on accessing deep brain circuits that traditionally require um, drilling and implanting into the brain. And so this is really a hardware and software project. And so they're working on building the first whole brain computer interface that's using ultrasound. Um, they operate as a nonprofit to build the platform, as well as miniaturize the hardware and establish clinical partnerships. They were able to launch really quickly, so they went from their initial funding coming in to their first in human data, I think within 8 months of launching. Um, One of the things that really enabled their speed of progress was this partnership with the Butterfly Network, which is one of the leading ultrasound on chip developers. And so, as a nonprofit, Forest was able to very quickly establish this partnership. Um, and so, they've been working on their technology roadmap, taking ultrasound from this very large multi-million dollar set of machinery that requires an ultrasound physicist to program to a handheld device and then ultimately a wearable device. Um, and then eventually an implantable device. And so they've been able to establish many different clinical partnerships to do initial studies of their handheld prototype, um, including with, I think, UCLA and Vanderbilt, as well as some hospitals in the UK. Um, the way that we incubate FROs is that we serve as the parent company. Each FRO is structured as an LLC under us, and that way we're able to provide the operational and financial support to get them launched and up and running really quickly. We have a governance structure um, where it's a small board with an FRO board member, a Convergent board member, and an independent board member. And so one of the main things that we do is support company operations. So they're able to plug into our employment and benefits and payroll systems, as well as, vendor onboarding. So these are all things that if they were set up as independent organizations, they would have to set up themselves, and can take quite a bit of time and experience to figure out. And so they're able to essentially plug into this operational backend and really focus on building out the team and making progress against their technical milestones. So as they near completion, FROs should be actively disseminating and deploying what they create into the real world. They, the impact of the FRO is often not seen, as much during the FRO phase as much as afterward. And so it's really important for them to do transition planning, and figure out, right, how they can actually catalyze their, what we call scientific scaled revolution. We want their tools and platforms, um, to be so effective that they reshape, they might reshape an entire industry or field. And this requires, right, active dissemination of the products that they create. Um, as an example of this, Forest Neurotech, um, which we talked about earlier, recently spun off and joined Merge Labs, which raised over $250 million to scale the ultrasound-based technology that they developed. And so our role is to help founders as they navigate these kinds of complex transitions, and hopefully ensure that the science reaches the widest possible impact and application that it can. Some of the things that we've learned from launching our first 10 FROs, which if you're interested in, you can check out in this field notes and frictions piece that was published in Issues in Science and Technology in the fall. But is essentially supporting founders um, as they uh, as they develop, we provide training and coaching as well as advice. Um, I think it's important that FROs are tackling very well-defined problems and theories of change. And so, very general goals like doing something for cancer is not really a very fro-shaped goal, but building a chemical barcoding system to enable single-cell proteomics at 100 times throughput is a well-defined FRO goal. Um, and so, I think it requires sort of a special blend of technical depth and organizational grit to be successful. Yeah, as I mentioned, we provide um, access to executive coaching to really help scientists transition from individual contributors to organizational leaders. And I think, um, there's other elements around the importance of the role of governance in these types of organizations as they deal with complex situations like leadership changes or challenges or transition planning. And I think, you know, another big element of what we've learned over the last 4 years is that there are many different kinds of milestones that are valuable. There are milestones that are funder facing. There are internal FRO milestones that are important for making sure that the team is aligned on what needs to be done on, not just a quarterly basis, but an annual basis and sort of like the overall vision of the organization. That's all I have in terms of slides. Happy to answer any questions and also encourage you to check out the NSF Tech Labs initiative, which they released a little bit of information earlier this year, and they've said that they will be releasing the request for proposal in April or May. They're looking to fund new organizations at the scale of around 10 to $50 million per organization per year. We don't know which focus areas they'll be selecting yet, but they've said that they'll announce those in the spring as well. So they're planning on funding a couple of organizations in 3 different focus areas. Cool. Sam, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Mary. So I'm hearing the funding is typically at the millions scale. Uh, do you ever provide funding for projects that are like early enough that they can get by on smaller amounts of money at first before they will need to scale up to the millions?
Mm,
And
we do launch projects as what we call seedlings. So these are still on the order of, I would say, $2 to $5 million over 1 or 2 years. And so, um, in cases where funders or the team feels that there's some amount of initial de-risking to be done, we might, and I think we've done that in 3 situations, maybe 3 or 4. Although in some of them, the funding for the full FRO was already lined up. It was just that the funders wanted to see sort of an initial stage gate of progress. And some of it could be related to, right, like, can the founding team really hire the types of people that it needs to accomplish its goals? Or it might be, right, sort of technical inflection point that needs to be met in order for the rest of the project to be possible.
yeah, that makes sense. Essentially, my business partner and I are at a point where we really just need the two of us to do some de-risking. And anyway, uh, maybe we can schedule another. I don't know if you would have time to meet with any of us one-on-one briefly, but
Yeah, yeah, possibly. I'm happy to talk to, yeah, anyone that has addition, sort of specific questions about an idea that they've been toying around with.
okay, that would be fantastic. I'll I'll find a way to hit you up
Um,
after this.
I think James had a question next.
Hey, Mary, thanks for the summary. Um, two questions, actually, they're uh, significantly different from one another. One, just sort of on a practical topic, the NSF program you referred to. Is your understanding that the sort of existing structure and approach that Convergent takes will ultimately be sort of compatible with the requirements that are being put forward by NSF, such that that could just be used as another mechanism by which Convergent would be facilitating funding support for an FRO? Or are you envisioning?
yeah, so I think what they've announced so far is really well aligned with what we do, and and how FROs are set up and organized. We've had some conversations with them as well. We're not, formally affiliated or anything like that, but I think that we would be well positioned sort of as a potential host organization for, different types of tech labs organizations.
Right.
Probably not, all types of tech labs organizations, but for some of the ones that I think would be a good fit for the initiative.
Great. The second question on a different topic is, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the case study that you referred to, Forest Neurotech, specifically on the topic of what it was that you folks saw from Forest early on that really was convincing in differentiating what their focus is on versus um, an organization that was primarily focused on product development that would ultimately be fundable through venture capital. Since particularly given the fact that they're now sort of fairly quickly moving toward more of a venture-based approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they wanted to develop a platform technology for that would be used in many different kinds of applications, and actually Merge, is interested in a subset of those potential applications. We're actually going to maintain the Forest Neurotech nonprofit to work on the other types of applications that Merge is not interested in. And so I think having that start as a nonprofit allows, right, the impact of the technology to be broader than if it were initially funded by venture capital.
Right.
I will
'Cause
say that the ecosystem, the funding ecosystem has also shifted. There's just a huge amount of interest in neurotechnology now versus a couple years ago when Forest was launched. And so it's kind of an interesting question of, right, if they were launched today, would they have gone down the FRO path versus the venture capital? It's actually not clear. But I think that there are benefits that, right, the philanthropic funders saw in setting it up as a nonprofit. And they've been able to, I think that we don't know for sure, but for example, their partnership with the Blood Butterfly Network, I think, was significantly smoothed because of their nonprofit status, as well as their ability to establish clinical partnerships with a bunch of different types of researchers. If you were to do all of that as a for-profit, it is certainly possible. It would probably cost you a lot more. And so it's, for some types of things, it's if you can get the non-dilutive funding, it can be more efficient, or you don't have to raise quite as much to do it in a nonprofit setting.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
I think Andrew was next.
Thanks, and sorry for being off camera. I'm in the car. Um, so you talked about the role of Convergent in a matchmaking sense. What does that mean in terms of your expectations for how extensive the founding team or the proposing team is relative to how much you view your role as really expanding and enhancing that team beyond that founding group?
Um, I I think that initially, our role is to help the founding team, right? So we're sort of a matchmaking organization also in the sense that, um, as we're talking to potential founders, right, we're sort of evaluating them to see if they're a good fit um, from our perspective as an FRO founder, and they're evaluating us to see if we're a good fit, right, as sort of an incubator or accelerator for them. In some cases, the founding teams have strong relationships with the funders that are interested in funding them. They have operational experience, and so we might provide some advice, but ultimately they decide to go and independently set up an organization. But in other cases, right, funders can be nervous about funding a completely new organization. So, for example, one of our FROs has a big grant from the Wellcome Trust. They did a huge amount of looking at our financial track record and our audits, right? These are kind of things that a completely new organization doesn't have. And so there's a level of trust that we have with some of our funders. I think in the initial stages of working with founders, it's really about right, figuring out the right shape of project. Some of that, a lot of that is right, impact oriented. Some of it is figuring out, right, like how to navigate the funding landscape. Um, for many of the projects, there's different shapes that they can take. There's different applications they could sort of present as initial pilots. Right, and some of those might be more or less appealing to different kinds of funders. And so initially our conversations are very informal. Um, we're happy to provide input and take project ideas into our database. Yeah, as a matchmaker, we don't have a pool of unrestricted funding that we can just allocate to projects. We have, right, a network of funders that are interested in these types of moonshots. Um, and increasingly, right, some interest from government funding sources. So last year we did a partnership with ARIA, the UK Science Funding Agency, that ultimately led to two FROs being funded and launched in the UK now. And we, played a big role in sourcing the projects as well as we organized a residency for the potential founders to participate in. And then from that pool, two were selected for funding. And so it's interesting to see, yeah, the NSF also expressing interest in these types of organizations. I'm sorry if I don't know if that actually answered your question.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Samuel?
So a quick follow-up on that. Hi, Mary. Is it just kind of analogize this? Should we think about this almost like a dating profile? Like if you have an idea of something you want to create, you talk with Convergent and kind of fill out information. That way you can be a part of this network. Is that kind of how operationally it works at the beginning?
Yeah, so for projects that don't have, a sort of anchor funder in mind, it is fairly serendipitous. If we'll talk to you, we'll give you feedback on how FRO shaped we think, your project is. And then, yeah, we can add you to our database. And so as we talk to different funders that have, interests in different areas, we'll right, come back to you if there's a particular funder that's, potentially interested and sort of help you, right? So it's like very light touch initially. And then once, right, we have maybe some funding sources that could be a good fit, it'll be a more involved conversation. I think up until the conversations with funders really develop further, right? It's all very informal. You could choose to set up your entity independently. You could choose to partner with us. Those are all some of the questions that, yeah, founders should be thinking about during that process. I think with something like NSF Tech Labs or with the ARIA opportunity, it sort of changes the script because there is an active, near-term funding opportunity. And so the way that we work with potential founders might be a little bit more discreet or organized.
And guiding grant applications, things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
A question along just in terms of what you're interested in. The lab that I'm working in currently is working with an institute here at Stanford to spin out something like an FRO, and they're in the mode of doing this kind of matchmaking and trying to find funding, et cetera. Is something that has that kind of institutional support already something that would be like within Convergent's purview, or are you looking for things that are more independent than that?
No, I mean, I think it could be compatible. Um, it's yeah, and that's something that, I think could just be discussed and figured out
Yeah,
down
yeah.
the road. We just have a fairly specific way of setting up, convergent FROs, but there are FROs that we've helped get set up that are
Nothing.
completely operationally independent of us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, James.
Sorry, yeah, I want to be polite and do the hand raise thing. So, Mary, could you comment a little bit on the extent to which the funders that have been accessed so far through your program tend to fit narrow versus a really diverse range of profiles? So, for example, you noted like Welcome Fund and relatively, and not even relatively, but very large existing sort of philanthropic organizations. Are we also looking at the possibility of raising money from folks that might otherwise be making that same money available through venture capital and are just happen to be interested in a more philanthropic angle, or is it much more sort of institutional type?
Hmm. Yeah, we work with a broad range of, or we have our FROs have funding from, I think, maybe like 35 different sources to date. So that includes a mix of these, more traditional or organized foundations, as well as high net worth individuals and their family offices. Um, and so it just sort of depends on the funder interest at any given moment in time.
Yeah.
Right? Because those can often be shifting or evolving. And so, I think that there's, for example, right, there are many funders in our network that are interested in neuroscience and, right, addressing, neurodegenerative diseases and things like that. There's also funders that are currently figuring out their strategy, but that might be generally interested in these types of moonshot problems. Um, I think that right now, yeah, we're still figuring out where some of those funders are oriented towards. And in the meantime, probably the sort of NSF opportunity is the most concrete near-term one.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's sort of underlying my question is I can see a natural um, synergy or a potential advantage to a large established philanthropic organization that has a very clearly defined purview to go do good but not try to make money from that money, um, to partner with Convergent as an organization that can help grease the skids to make it more credible, more fast, et cetera. On the more sort of like private money side, I guess I'm wondering like sort of what do those funders see it as? What's their goal? What's in it for them? Is it, to the extent that does it fall much more on the sort of like, well, it's pure philanthropy versus potential personal advantage to having a seat at the table for like the next thing, right? Of a potential commercial opportunities that could result from the transformational change. Maybe you could comment a little bit on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think to date, the right, the types of funders that we work with at the scales of funding that we do, they have funding that they're allocating to both, right, like venture capital or like angel investments, as well as to philanthropy. And
Mhm.
so they just are working with different pools of money, and but I think that they share an interest in having a really big impact with that money. And so I think that's why it's really, it can be important to be able to tell the story of why an FRO is really needed for, the whatever it is you're trying to build, and the benefits of that model versus another model. And so some of our FROs have thought deeply about, right, like, should I structure this as a startup? Should I, right, should I pursue a nonprofit approach? Um, and you really have to be clear about like what the pros and cons of each of those models are. And and that's very important to convey to the funders as well, right? So um, as a right for-profit startup, maybe you can raise more money, but you're limited by the types of applications and impact. And maybe the funder, right, does find the narrative really compelling of developing a platform technology and making it widely available for, right, research as well as applications. And, there's always the possibility of downstream investment. But I don't think we've seen evidence that our philanthropic funders are really driven by the interest in, downstream funding opportunities from the FROs, even though those certainly exist. They have, right, plenty of capital there, so they're sort of allocating to like both routes.
Hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Mary, for providing such great information about Convergent Research. We appreciate it. Hope everyone has a good day. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for all your questions and thanks for inviting me. All right, bye.